Ch.6. Winter 878. It had been a swift-footed, lively housekeeper, black hair parted under a mob cap, chatting 19 to the dozen who had, the second night in Doya, taken her to a blanket and straw bed at the back of the kitchen with the other servants. The woman might have taken her the first night, except the drinking had gone on so long into the early hours of 1st November that Osrith bowled along with Domhnall's other warriors to the stables, where she had been awoken, lying between Finolai and Fergus, by an irate stable master. Osrith had been first to awake, and had been spoken to at length by the man, catching only about one word in 7 and understanding even less. She did understand a pail of icy water over her for her insolence and being knocked to the ground before the third of Domhnall's warriors, Tadg, a blonde-haired, wiry boy of about 19, sprang at him, screaming a stream of equally unintelligible words back. Finolai had pulled him off, and the commotion had brought a worse for wear Domhnall into the stable, barking orders at each of them, before hauling Osrith off to the fortress. Aunt Muir will not permit you to reside with the men, Domhnall explained. I know you desire to be a warrior, Osrith. However, while we live here, I have another role for you. Osrith had then been sent off to the kitchens, to help the elderly cook prepare the All Saints' feast, a slight man who turned out to be deaf, and whose words made a little more sense. She supposed that there weren't that many ways to say meat and vegetables in Gaelic, no matter the dialect, and she soon fell into the routine, so similar it had been to Dunnottar Castle. But it took until the morning after that, having been woken early in the servants' sleeping quarter at the back of the kitchen to be told what she must do. The children need to be taught, Domhnall explained, as he took Osrith to see his aunt. And they need to practice their learning. Osrith protested that while she could read and write, she was not a scholar, nor did she know enough Gaelic even to write it. Your role will be to see the children complete what the monks tell them they must do. Since I brought the Iona manuscript, they have been busy completing it and binding it. They do not have time to wait for the children to complete it. Ah, he said, opening the door to the royal rooms. This is my aunt, Domhnall explained, as the woman, who had been by the king's side, nodded. She was beautiful. Long, black hair framed skin that was milk white. She wore a linen dress dyed dark yellow with lichen and around her waist a circlet of beaded chain on which hung a key. Domhnall waited beside Osrith, but his aunt said, I would speak with this girl alone, narrowing her eyes at Osrith as the door clicked behind her nephew. You are a servant of Domhnall, and a companion of Constantine? Muir said, looking at Osrith with curiosity. And your family were murdered as you travelled to Iona? Yes, lady, nodded Osrith. And, you have a sword. My father's. Your father's sword. Muir looked at her again. And you are 15? 13, lady. And you were educated? At home. By my father. Osrith's responses had been direct and prompt. Yet, this woman, the daughter of Sainid MacAlpin, was intelligent and shrewd. She watched as Malmuir narrowed her eyes. Osrith shuddered as she considered her limited options, for, if she did indeed believe her to be Elfric's niece, Osrith had walked freely into a trap of her own making. She felt her sword hand lower. It would be her only chance. But instead, Muir smiled warmly, then took Osrith's hands in her own, looking at the damaged one, with the square arrow bolt scar. My brother chose to be kind to you, she nodded. For you saved Constantine's life. And you have inspired Domhnall's respect, a very difficult thing to do. My nephew does not impress easily. You fought in battle. All that is incredible for a girl of your age. Incredible, thought Osrith, grimly. It was that, or become a peace cow. Poor Edra, as she had once been, would be violated night after night, and probably murdered, for the Danes perhaps to send muscle to Elfric, if he was lucky. It is also not an acceptable role for you, the Neill Queen continued. While you stay with us, you will not fight. Our warriors in Ireland will not tolerate women fighting, that is men's business, no matter what the degenerate Picts do. No, lady. Muir held out her hand to Osrith, who stepped forward as the queen took her shoulders. Your father taught you to fight? Osrith nodded. We lived at Sea Huises. We were often raided by Norse and Danes. I have killed many. But you will fight none here. My husband has his own way of dealing with the Norse, and it proves effective. Osrith felt her hand moving to the hilt of her sword again. Muir laughed. As it is so precious to you, I will not take it from you. But you must not carry it. She stepped back from Osrith. It will be in my care, as the royal children are in yours. Mary, Era, and Gormlath, my own son, Neill and my other nephews, Maldub and Malduin, they will be your charges. Come. Queen Malmuir walked towards an oak door opposite the one through which she and Domhnall had come. Beyond, in various pursuits of sewing, swordplay and a game of stones, the children were busy, under the watchful eye of one of the older servants Osrith recalled seeing in the kitchen. Muir called the children to her as Osrith looked at their faces. The girls were older than the boys, a little younger than her. Muir explained she had an older son, Domhnall, named after Domhnall, who was old enough to study with the priests alongside his sword work. He and Contentine are well matched, Muir added. They are both keeping my husband busy in teaching them. The last child, a boy of about 6, was brought in from the woods when his mother noticed he was missing. On this cold November morning he was without his trousers and it looked as if he had been walking around in mud on his knees. I found worms, Neill said, holding up a handful as his mother expressed horror at his appearance. Osrith found herself suppressing a giggle. Muir then instructed Marsaili to clean him and dress him again. Without the worms, she added, then led Osrith back to her own room. You will continue in the kitchens today and we'll take the children over to the monastery after breakfast tomorrow, Muir instructed. When they are in your charge, you must ensure their work is done, and return them in the evening to the nursery. You should have free time to wash before dinner. May I leave the fortress? Osrith asked. When the children are not required to work. If you do not want to live, Muir replied. I can fight, Osrith pressed. Muir smiled. You have never seen an Irish Gael fight. And there are Norse. She put a hand on Osrith's shoulder. While I do not keep you here as a prisoner, will you respect what is asked of you? 88,888,888. Osrith, to her surprise, found that she liked the children and looked forward to their daily progress over to the monastery. Midwinter turned to spring, birds chirruped and built nests, and her little party of 6 children would walk in line over to the great archway of the monastery. The girls were very proper, though would answer her back in Gaelic when she gave instructions, and Osrith was not altogether certain that Mary was being polite, for she would often watch the very end of what might have been a smirk as the girl looked round to Era and Gormlath. The boys, when she had finally got them used to sitting at a table and copying from a large ledger of bound manuscripts, some in Gaelic, some in an alphabet Osrith had never seen before, made of lines at different angles, were compliant. At the end, as they walked back to the castle, would all beg Osrith for a story, and they in turn would tell her one they knew. Whatever happened, though, Neill always seemed to be in a filthy state, either before Osrith took her or on their way back, that his mother began to call him Grubby Knees, though he could be bribed into keeping clean with a spoonful of honey via the kitchens. One morning, as the night frost had still not begun to melt and a brisk breeze blew in from the northern sea, Osrith's attention was caught as something flew through the air and caught her above the temple. She turned to find another whistling through the crisp air, this time, landing just beyond Gormlath's feet. The girl jumped, gasping at the near miss. From the far corner of the courtyard, 2 warriors, who had been engaging in morning sword training, were staring at Osrith's little group. Another stone came, and Neill howled, clinging to Osrith's legs. Ch.6. Osrith shouted, as she bent to comfort little Grubby Knees. The stone had skimmed the top of his head and had begun to bleed. She kissed it, pulling him close as another stone flew by. Ch.6. Prince Domhnall, Findlaith's eldest son, imitated her imperfect Irish. Nat Ilg, Salashadapicton. He threw another stone and laughed when it hit his brother again. Tell him to stop. Osrith shouted to his opponent, as she hurried the children towards the monastery. Constantine, The opponent turned to Domhnall, muttering something. Domhnall laughed, and looked at Osrith. Abuthab Is she a boy? Thami Bucailagam, shouted back Osrith, awkwardly. I am a boy. Nagalian. Not a girl. Is this right? Laughed Domhnall, mockingly, to his cousin. She is a boy. She does do as a boy does, Constantine confirmed. She can fight. Domhnall looked back at Osrith. Can she hump serving wenches? Domhnall called out her, but Osrith had turned her head and continued to walk towards the monastery. You, girl. Domhnall shouted. I'm talking to you. But Osrith would not look at him. And she is a servant? Bawled Domhnall to Constantine, outraged that a servant had ignored him. He bent to take up a stone, much larger than the pebbles he had thrown before. Osrith stepped in front of little Malduin, who it would have certainly hit if she hadn't. Instead, it bounced off her thigh, painfully, and deflected down into the mud. You know she can kill you? Constantine said to his with interest. She fought beside Domhnall, defended him as he killed Ivar the Boneless. I saw her, he added, as Domhnall looked at Constantine with incredulity. I have seen her kill a dozen Norse, he added, grumpily. Then, let's just very well see. Without any time for Constantine to stop him, Domhnall had wrenched his cousin's sword from him, stalking over to Osrith. He thrust it onto the floor in front of her. Osrith said nothing, looking from the sword to the boy not much older than she was, leaving the blade where it was. She made to continue to the monastery, nodding at the two girls to go on and scooping up Neill and giving him to Mary, then taking Maldub and Malduin, one arm round each. Lies! Screamed Domhnall, charging at her. Gormlith screamed, and the boys ran towards their sister as Domhnall ran towards Osrith. He would have skewered her shoulder had she not sprang out of the way. The boy turned and ran at her again. Osrith ducked, this time, seizing up the sword from the mud, ducking again as a slicing blow came her way. She swung upwards with Constantine's sword, blocking another, knowing she must not be on the offensive. But this boy had to stop, or he would kill her. A shout from the monastery brought monks to the door, one ushering in the children. More people gathered to watch. You cannot throw stones at the children. Osrith shouted to him. Domhnall pushed again, and Osrith slipped a little in the mud. I will not fight you. Then, I will kill you, Pictish scum. Domhnall screamed back, in triumph. And he drove his sword down, and down. Osrith fought. Down near his legs she saw her chance and, using Constantine's sword for balance, got low to her feet and drove against the soft ground. She slipped, but it was enough as she wrapped her arms around both legs, her cheek by his thigh. Domhnall didn't fall, but it was enough to stop a third assault, and he staggered back as Osrith raised Constantine's sword again, parrying his blow, driving him back again. She was aware of eyes on her, but as a periphery. Background, as she continued to press her advantage. She could kill him now, Osrith knew. 2 steps, 2 more blows, and he gone. Then she stopped. For behind her arms held hers. Osrith staggered back, as Domhnall got to his feet. A smirk played at the corner of his lips as she backed into he who had restrained her. Osrith struggled, trying to worm away, but an arm wound round her neck. Domhnall strode over to her leeringly, but Findlaith, the king, pushed his son away. You fought well, for a Pictish boy, he growled, close to her head. Domhnall stared at his father, sullenly. Osrith tried to move again, but the king held her fast, leaning over by her head, his orange-red beard flowing into her eyeline. Do you know what we do with boys from Alba? He asked ferociously, close to her ear. We take them by the ankles and swing them over our heads till they fly back over the Irish Sea and land with their asses in the water. Osrith found she was trembling as that broke into a rumbling guffaw. Domhnall stalked, scowling towards them, sword raised in Osrith. You leave this boy to his work, the king shouted at his son, tremulously, he could show you some things. She is a girl, at hair, shot back Domhnall. Osrith shuddered as the king reached down her chest, hand flat, then squeezed at her, closing her eyes as he pressed her back against his towering body. A lump pressed into her back. Then the king laughed, heartily. Go, girl, to your job, then that may still yet keep my elder son alive. Osrith staggered a little in the mud, not daring to turn round to look at the king, and stalked through the damp mud. The children were waiting for her, eyes wide. I wonder who will hump her first, I or my father, Domhnall shouted, smirking at Constantine. He picked up Constantine's sword and threw it low in his direction. She has chosen chastity, Osrith heard Constantine shout back. She will fight anyone who tries. Not if the guards hold her down, she won't. From the doors of the monastery, Osrith turned as a huge clatter of metal reverberated from the ground. Constantine had charged at his cousin, feet kicking, fists striking, spilling blood until Finoli and Fergus, 10 minutes later, pulled him off. Later that night, when she had served on dinner duty for the royal family, Domhnall's eyes on her all the time and the king laughing heartily when she was close, Osrith made her way wearily back to the kitchens. The cook had made a vegetable stew again that night, water, seaweed and tubers into which he dropped a scalding hot stone from the fire. When Osrith approached with a bowl, the cook shot out a hand and pushed her away. When she tried again, the cook took a wooden spoon and beat her over the arms and face until she retreated back to her bed. It was Finoli who crept into the kitchen later on that night, with ale and bread. He seemed somehow elated, his face beamed, his skin seemed somehow to glow, yet a part of him seemed harassed, as if he'd fought 1,000 battles. Because you fought with Domhnall, he explained, tearing some bread up, kindly, then pushing the ale jar into her other hand. Osrith supped deeply from the jar, and bit at the bread, hungrily before thanking him profusely. Not me, Finoli replied, sinking back against the wall, from Domhnall.